from war wound to secret formula. In the year 1886, Atlanta advanced through the dust of construction sites, the smoke of locomotives, and the constant murmur of a city trying to rebuild itself after the turbulent years of the War of Secession. The streets were filled with veterans carrying difficult memories, merchants searching for opportunities on every corner, and professionals who, as best they could, tried to reconstruct an entire life with scarce resources and fragile hopes. Among all those stories that crossed paths each day, there was one that walked with a weight deeper than what could be seen at first glance. That of John Stith Pemberton, pharmacist, amateur chemist, and soldier marked by a wound that never truly healed. The saber cut he had received left not only a physical scar, but also a dependence on morphine that became a persistent shadow, a shadow that followed his steps from the first minute of every morning to the last line he wrote in his formula notebook at nightfall. Before going deeper into this story, I am very curious to know from which place in the world and at what time you join me tonight. I always enjoy reading those details in the comments. Pemberton spent endless hours leaning over his work table, surrounded by bottles with handwritten labels, natural extracts, medicinal alcohol, and pages filled with disordered calculations. The addiction made it harder for him to concentrate each day, but it also fed a kind of creative urgency. He wanted to break free from that cycle, escape the dependence that consumed so many veterans, and the only way he knew how to attempt it was by following his scientific intuition. In that small laboratory, among the bitter smell of cinchona bark, the acidity of citrus fruits, and the resinous warmth of certain plants, Pemberton began searching for a mixture that could ease physical pain, and, at the same time, calm an inner restlessness that grew without pause. His obsession led him to experiment with different variations of the popular coca wines that had circulated through Europe for decades. Those stimulating beverages, made from coca leaves and wine, had gained fame on the continent thanks to physicians who claimed they could fight fatigue and revitalize the spirit. But Pemberton did not want to simply imitate what others had already created. He insisted on adapting those ideas to his own context, reinterpreting them, testing new combinations, and above all, finding something that worked for him, even if he was not yet aware of what he was about to generate. Every afternoon, when the sunlight began to enter the laboratory window at an angle, Pemberton prepared small containers where he mixed ingredients that seemed to have nothing in common. Some days, the improvised kitchen filled with sweet vapors. Other days, with a harsher, almost medicinal aroma. He often wrote down results that he later crossed out in frustration, and although his acquaintances saw him trapped in a routine that seemed to lead nowhere, he continued with quiet determination. He knew many of his tests would fail, but he also felt that each attempt brought him a little closer to a formula that kept slipping away, even though it already brushed the edge of his imagination. Life in Atlanta did not make things easy. Money was always scarce, medicines lacked clear regulation, and pharmacists worked in an environment where each person had to defend their own creations. Pemberton was accustomed to that competitive atmosphere, though he was also aware that his health was not on his side. Still, something inside him pushed him to keep mixing, shaking, and testing, and that persistence led him, on a spring afternoon, to obtain a dark, thick, and aromatic syrup that caught his attention from the very first moment he let it rest. It had a deep tone, with a balance that felt different from anything he had prepared before. That liquid was not yet the beverage the world would come to know, but it already contained the character that would eventually define everything that followed. Pemberton, always meticulous, began diluting small amounts of the syrup into different bases to observe how it behaved. He tried it with plain water, with wine, with various solutions, attempting to identify which one best enhanced the nuances he sought. The process was slow, detailed, and precise, but it gave him the sensation of moving toward a more ambitious result, even if he still could not see it clearly. What he did know was that this mixture represented an opportunity and a kind of relief. Even if it did not completely solve his personal suffering, the syrup seemed to calm him momentarily, while the experimentation kept him busy, focused, and in some way hopeful. What had begun as an almost intimate attempt to improve his own well-being was beginning to take a different form, as if the formula were claiming a larger path than the one he had imagined at first. Pemberton shared his discovery with a few trusted acquaintances, men who frequented his laboratory and often joined him in conversations about medicine, chemistry, and the infinite variations of tonics that filled pharmacies at the time. Those early opinions did not predict overwhelming success, but they did awaken curiosity. The mixture had something different, a stimulating and sweet undertone that lingered in memory. And that initial reaction was enough for Pemberton to continue refining quantities, adjusting proportions, and perfecting aromatic notes until he transformed the syrup into a base that could be combined with something that was beginning to gain popularity. Carbonated water, that small detail, the effervescence that transformed ordinary drinks into distinct experiences, would be decisive. In soda fountains, increasingly common in the United States, the public sought refreshing options, something that made life feel a little lighter. Pemberton still could not grasp the scope that his mixture would eventually have, but the combination of his syrup with sparkling water was about to change everything. That sense that something important was beginning to take shape would accompany his story from this point forward. The newly created syrup, the laboratory filled with papers, and that Atlanta, that was just beginning to reorganize itself, would soon be the backdrop where decisive figures would appear, transforming this experiment into a product with its own name. And little by little, the formula, without him suspecting it, would begin to slip from his control to give way to a business story that was only beginning to awaken. A brand is born by accident. In that Atlanta of the late 19th century, where everyday life revolved around the square, the train station, and a few strategically located pharmacies, the dark syrup that Pemberton had developed was still only a promise trapped in glass bottles lined up in his laboratory. A mixture with potential, but without a name, without an identity, and without a story accompanying it beyond the small circle of people who knew it. The next step, which on the surface seemed like a minor detail, consisted of taking that concentrate to a place where it could meet the public. And that place was the Jacobs Pharmacy, one of the busiest in the city, a space where sick customers mixed with curious visitors looking for novelties and young people who gathered around the soda fountain to share a different moment after long and exhausting days. The pharmacy had that air of a social center disguised as a health establishment, with shelves filled with orderly jars, posters announcing miraculous tonics, and a counter where the pharmacist or his assistants prepared effervescent drinks that had become fashionable among the inhabitants of Atlanta, who saw in those combinations of syrups and carbonated water a small spark of modernity in the midst of a life still marked by reconstruction. Pemberton enters that setting with his thick syrup, ready to test what happens when that concentrate is mixed with the sparkling bubble that so attracted customers. The experiment becomes an apparently routine gesture, almost bureaucratic, a new product arriving at the soda fountain to see whether the public accepts it. When the syrup is served for the first time mixed with carbonated water, in a tall glass like the ones that were always placed on the counter, the reaction does not take the form of a great event. There are no applauses or headlines, only a few customers who approach, taste the liquid, frown for an instant, and then nod with a certain curiosity in their gaze, as someone who recognizes a different flavor, more complex than the rest of the usual drinks. The sweet taste, slightly spiced, with a touch that recalls medicinal tonics but feels more gentle, begins to spark comments. Some speak of how refreshing it is. Others mention that it is pleasing to the stomach. And among scattered remarks and gestures of approval, that experiment begins to turn into something recurrent behind the counter. In that environment moves another key figure in the story. Someone who does not wear a pharmacist's coat nor possesses a scientific reputation, but who understands the value of words and of image. Frank Mason Robinson, accountant and Pemberton's trusted man. Robinson observes the product with different eyes, the eyes of someone who thinks in terms of customers, invoices, and presence in the consumer's mind, and he realizes that this syrup that mixes with carbonated water is still, in terms of identity, a blank space. It has no commercial name, only a couple of technical descriptions that excite no one, and it lacks a hook that distinguishes it from the long list of tonics that filled the pages of the newspapers of the period. Robinson understands that if they want the drink to stand out among the rest, it must be called in a way that stays in the memory without effort, something that sounds good when spoken, and that, in addition, can be written elegantly in advertisements and posters. He begins then to play with words, based on the ingredients that he knows are part of the formula. Coca leaves and cola nuts. From that conceptual mixture arises the idea of combining both terms into a compact, sonorous name with its own rhythm. Thus appears the proposal that would change the course of the brand forever: Coca-Cola. The repetition of the letter C, The musicality of the whole, and the lightness with which it is pronounced, make it a perfect candidate to fill the empty space that until that moment surrounded the drink. But Robinson does not stop there. Aware that a strong name needs to be accompanied by an equally powerful image, he sits down to write it by hand using his best calligraphy, drawing long, curved letters with a fluid style that combines elegance and closeness, and that, without anyone suspecting it at that moment, will become one of the most recognizable visual identities in history. That improvised logo on paper, the result of a moment of concentration and aesthetic taste, ends up being much more than a pretty word. It is the birth of a brand in a modern sense, long before the concept of branding was studied in business schools. That apparently simple gesture, writing the name of the drink with a distinctive calligraphy, anticipates a deep lesson for anyone who looks at this story from the perspective of entrepreneurship. Pemberton had created a product with an interesting formula and an appealing flavor, but it was Robinson who, by giving it name, form, and face, began to transform one more syrup into a symbol. The drink, which was already being served in the Jacobs pharmacy for 5 cents a glass, was beginning to have something that differentiated it, something that allowed a customer to arrive, lean on the counter and ask for that specific name instead of simply any refreshment. In the accounting books of the period, it would be recorded that, in its early days, sales were modest, on the order of a few glasses per day, a figure that today seems almost insignificant if one thinks of the empire that would come afterward. But behind those timid numbers there was already a structure forming, a product with a defined formula, a point of sale that offered it regularly, a name easy to remember and a logo capable of appearing on posters, advertisements, and all kinds of surfaces. In a context in which most pharmaceutical preparations entered and left the market without leaving a trace, Coca-Cola was beginning to stand out, even if at the beginning that contrast was perceived as just one more nuance. The everyday scene in the pharmacy helps imagine the dynamics of this early stage. Regular customers who, after trying various options at the soda fountain, begin to repeat that particular drink. Young people who comment among themselves that this bubbling mixture has something special. Older people who approach out of curiosity and, after tasting it, recommend to others that they try it when they pass through the city. The brand does not yet have spectacular campaigns, nor agreements with major events, but it is meeting the first requirement of any entrepreneurial creation, finding a small group of users who adopt it and recommend it. Meanwhile, Robinson continues exploring ways to make the name visible. He begins to imagine it on posters hanging on the wall, in local newspaper advertisements, in supports that, at that time, functioned like the social networks of the city, shop windows, canopies, and any surface where the attention of a passerby could be captured. Each time he writes Coca-Cola with his characteristic calligraphy, he reinforces a feature that with the years will become cultural heritage. What at that moment is only a practical decision, aimed at standing out in a competitive environment, lays the foundations of an identity that will survive generations, wars, economic crises, and technological changes. It is important to understand that, in this initial phase, no one is thinking of a world empire, of chains of bottling plants, nor of global campaigns. The mental horizon is much closer, making the drink work in Atlanta, making people return to ask for it, making the pharmacy see value in continuing to serve it, making it receive good comments in casual conversations. The epic dimension will come later, but here, in these first steps, something equally decisive is being forged. The personality of the brand, that mixture of flavor, name, aesthetics, and experience that together create a bond between the product and the person who consumes it. Pemberton, for his part, observes with a mixture of pride and concern. Pride because the drink is beginning to be recognized, because the name proposed by his accountant is heard more and more in the mouths of customers. And concern because his health and financial situation remain fragile. His dependence on morphine continues to limit his daily life, and debts never stop looming. The drink that they now call Coca-Cola shows signs of future, but that future still does not guarantee the stability he urgently needs. That tension between potential and fragility is one of the most human elements of this stage, and it will be precisely that weakness that opens the door to new characters who will see in the brand a value that he has not yet been able to exploit. Thus, While the name Coca-Cola begins to fix itself in the minds of Atlanta consumers and the handwritten logo becomes a discreet but constant presence in the pharmacy and in the first advertisements, the story is preparing to turn toward the realm of tough business decisions. The incipient success of the product coincides with the personal difficulties of its creator, and that contrast will end up triggering movements that will transfer the ownership of the formula and the name, giving way to a stage in which others will know how to see, with greater ambition, the reach of something that was born almost by accident at a soda fountain. Pemberton sells and loses his legacy. While the name Coca-Cola was beginning to be recognized at the counters of the soda fountains of Atlanta and the elegant logo created by Frank Robinson was slipping into small advertisements and posters, the life of John Stith Pemberton was moving in a very different direction, marked by physical fragility, economic uncertainty, and a dependence on morphine that conditioned every decision he made. The drink seemed to be walking upward, with a trajectory that was ascending, although still modest, while its creator was sinking into an uncomfortable mixture of debts, pain, and accumulated exhaustion. That difference in rhythms, the rise of the product and the fall of the man, is essential to understanding the movements that would come next and that would end up separating Pemberton forever from the brand he had brought to life with so much effort. The days in his laboratory no longer had the restless energy of the early years, when each combination of ingredients opened a new door, but instead carried the muted tone of someone who finds himself pushed to sell parts of his work in order to sustain daily life. The accounts did not add up, medical expenses increased, and the pharmacy business was not enough to support the weight of his obligations, so Pemberton began to consider something he had avoided for a long time, letting go of the rights to his most promising creation. It was not a sudden decision nor a single movement, but a slow, almost draining process in which he negotiated with different partners, sold parts of the formula, and fragmented, without realizing it, the future of Coca-Cola. At that time, the value of a brand was not measured the way it is today. People did not speak about intellectual property in the sophisticated terms we know now, and many inventors saw licenses and sales of rights as a quick way to obtain liquidity. Pemberton began to sign agreements with several investors who saw a certain potential in the drink but who, like him, could not imagine the dimension it would eventually reach. Some acquired small shares, others secured portions of the rights to manufacture and distribute, and little by little the ownership structure of Coca-Cola turned into a confusing puzzle in which nobody had a complete vision of the whole. The creator, weakened by illness and trapped by his need for immediate money, kept giving up ground on a board that required endurance and calm, two things he no longer possessed. Among all the names moving in that environment, one began to stand out. A man with a profile very different from that of Pemberton, Asa Candler, also a pharmacist, but with a distinctly commercial mentality. Candler had a special instinct for detecting products with potential and a disciplined determination to turn them into solid businesses. He observed the evolution of Coca-Cola with growing attention, analyzed the reaction of the public, reviewed the figures, and understood that behind that dark syrup and that striking name there was more than a pharmacy curiosity. He perceived an opportunity that required organization, capital, systematic work, and, above all, control. Unlike Pemberton, who lived trapped between creativity and pain, Candler moved with determination in the field of negotiation. He began by buying small shares here and there, speaking with the various partners who had secured parts of the pie, gathering documents and agreements, many times at prices that today would seem ridiculous compared to the value the brand would achieve. His strategy was not based on a spectacular move, but on a succession of calculated steps, identifying who held which right, sitting with each one, closing a deal, and moving to the next. Meanwhile, Pemberton, increasingly ill, saw control slipping from his hands almost without fully realizing it, trusting that the present sales would give him some peace in his final years. The business tragedy, if seen from the perspective of the entrepreneur who creates but does not manage, becomes clear at this point. Pemberton knew that Coca-Cola had something special. He had seen it in the reaction of customers and in the growing loyalty of those who returned to ask for the same glass again and again, but his view was conditioned by immediate urgency. He did not have a team to protect him. He did not have specialized lawyers, and he did not have a clear plan to develop the brand in the long term. The combination of creative talent and business weakness opened a space in which Candler, with his organizing mentality, advanced with a clarity that would be decisive. With time, and as the agreements accumulated, Asa Candler managed to obtain majority control of the formula and the rights of Coca-Cola. The legal situation of the brand went through tangled moments, with papers that overlapped and different versions of what, exactly, had been sold in each deal. But the final result was that, when the story made the leap toward a more ambitious business dimension, the helm was no longer in Pemberton's hands. The man who had mixed the ingredients in his laboratory, who had dreamed of a drink capable of relieving pain and awakening spirits, was left with very little, almost nothing, of the future value that his idea was about to generate. His personal life followed a sad path. His health continued to deteriorate. His dependence on morphine did not disappear. And, in the end, Pemberton died in the year 1888 without having enjoyed the prosperity that his creation was about to generate for others. His family, especially his son, attempted at some moments to recover or benefit from part of it, but the decisions had already been made. The rights had been transferred, and the destiny of Coca-Cola was walking toward a horizon that moved farther from the Pemberton surname with every new step the company took under the leadership of Candler. For those who observe this story from the perspective of entrepreneurship, this section of the narrative works almost like a warning written in very clear ink. Having a brilliant idea, creating a product that connects with people, and generating a brand with potential is an essential part of the journey, but it guarantees nothing if the creator does not manage, for whatever reason, to protect his position, surround himself with people who complement his weaknesses, or structure the business in a way that does not leave him at the mercy of present urgencies. Pemberton personifies the visionary inventor who, trapped in his own internal struggle, lacks the strength and the resources to sustain what he created when the market begins to demand structure, clarity, and ambition. On the other hand, Asa Candler represents the figure of the businessman who knows how to read the right moment to make a decisive bet. He did not invent the formula, he did not come up with the name, and he did not draw the logo, but he was capable of understanding that in that combination of elements, there was a brand with the capacity to expand far beyond a local pharmacy. His role was not romantic nor heroic in the classical sense, but it was decisive on a strategic level. By consolidating the rights, assuming the risk, and organizing the business, he prepared the ground for Coca-Cola to cease being a counter-curiosity and begin becoming a company with a desire for permanence. This part of the story, in which the creator gives up ground and the businessman takes control, reveals with raw clarity that recurring tension between creativity and management that is repeated so many times in the world of business. There are projects that perish because they never find their Candler, and others in which the Candler arrives too early and suffocates the original spark. In the case of Coca-Cola, the transition was painful for its founder, but it ended up creating a business structure capable of resisting crises, growing in other states, and later expanding beyond the country of origin. As the figure of Pemberton fades and his name dissolves into the legal documents, the company enters a moment in which decisions will stop focusing on the formula and begin focusing on how to take it farther and farther. Atlanta will no longer be only the place where a new drink is served, but the starting point of an organization that will begin to think about distribution, marketing, geographic expansion, and building reputation, tasks for which Asa Candler felt particularly prepared, and that would mark the beginning of a different, much more ambitious and structured stage in the life of Coca-Cola. Asa Candler, the first visionary. When Asa Griggs Candler stepped fully into the history of Coca-Cola, Atlanta had already left behind the harshest stage of reconstruction and was beginning to shape itself as a city looking toward commerce, industry, and the opportunities brought by the new century. Candler, the son of farmers, trained in the world of pharmacy and with a nearly obsessive discipline for work, observed that context with a mixture of ambition and pragmatism. Unlike Pemberton, whose life revolved around the laboratory and the search for relief from his own pain, he thought in terms of organization, expansion, and control, and he saw in that dark syrup with a catchy name a raw material that could be refined and turned into a gigantic business as long as someone had the patience to build it brick by brick. Candler's personality was marked by an almost Puritan work ethic. He was known for arriving early, personally reviewing every detail of his businesses, and demanding from those around him a level of commitment that bordered on extreme. When he finally consolidated the rights to Coca-Cola, He was not dazzled by the romantic idea of owning a famous drink, but instead began to ask himself how he could transform that mixture into a profitable, sustainable, and continuously growing organization. For him, the formula was only the beginning of a much broader process, one that involved production, distribution, advertising, finances, and, above all, a clear vision of where he wanted to lead the brand. One of his first moves was to put the house in order from a legal and corporate standpoint. In the year 1892, Candler decided to formally incorporate the Coca-Cola Company, creating a business structure that provided the brand with a stable, legal, and operational framework. This step, which may seem routine today, was at that time a sign of serious ambition. It was no longer a simple pharmacy product managed in an artisanal manner, but a company with social capital, shareholders, and clear responsibilities. The decision to turn the business into a company with its own legal identity was the foundation upon which all future strategies would rest, because it allowed him to attract resources, align interests, and professionalize daily operations. From that point on, Candler set out to achieve something that very few understood in his time, turning a drink into a constant presence in urban life, almost like part of the landscape. To accomplish this, he had to shift the focus away from traditional pharmaceutical thinking. Medicinal formulas were promoted with promises of healing and were limited to appearing in prescriptions and discreet advertisements. He wanted Coca-Cola to leave that narrow corner and go out into the streets, settle in the most popular soda fountains, advertise in newspapers, be painted on walls, and stay in the consumer's mind even before they felt thirsty. This difference in approach, that transition from the consulting room to the collective imagination, defined his way of working. One of the most intelligent moves he implemented was the massive use of free consumption coupons. Candler understood that anyone might feel curious about a new product, but that the step of trying it for the first time was often stopped by price, distrust, or simple laziness. So he ordered the printing of thousands of coupons that allowed people to enjoy a glass of Coca-Cola without paying anything. Coupons that were distributed throughout the city, mailed, and handed directly to potential customers. The idea was simple and bold at the same time. Sacrifice part of the immediate income to build something much more valuable. The habit. Whoever tried the drink for free and enjoyed it was far more likely to return and pay for it, and that cycle, repeated over and over, began to feed a steady flow of loyal consumers. In parallel, Candler firmly invested in an overwhelming visual presence. He had the name and logo of Coca-Cola appear on calendars, wall clocks, metal trays, store awnings, roadside signs, and practically any surface that could serve as an advertising support. Each of those objects functioned as a silent reminder that accompanied the customer throughout the day, in the kitchen, in the store, in the barbershop, or at the train station. The drink still cost 5 cents, but the company invested significant amounts to ensure that those 5 cents were paid again and again, in different places and for different reasons. The goal was not an isolated sale, but to occupy a permanent space in people's minds. While other entrepreneurs saw advertising as an occasional expense, Candler viewed it as a structural investment. It was not just about placing ads, but about creating an environment in which Coca-Cola was the obvious choice when someone wanted to refresh themselves or take a break. That insistence on visual repetition, on the coherence of the message, and on the use of Robinson's handwritten logo as a seal of authenticity helped the brand begin to acquire an aura of trust. The average consumer might not know who Candler was, but they associated the name Coca-Cola with something familiar, present, and accessible in numerous locations throughout the city. Another key aspect of his vision was discipline regarding quality and standardization. Candler understood that if he intended to turn the drink into a product present in multiple cities and states, he could not allow each soda fountain to mix the syrup as they pleased, with variable proportions that altered the flavor. He dedicated efforts to establishing precise formulas, clear instructions, and controls that ensured that a glass of Coca-Cola served in Atlanta had the same profile as one served in another town. This obsession with consistency, so common in major brands today, was a novelty in a world where many pharmaceutical preparations and refreshments were made almost like individual crafts. Candler also knew how to surround himself with a team aligned with his way of understanding the business. Although he maintained strong and centralized leadership, he began creating an internal culture in which hard work, loyalty, and identification with the company had enormous weight. Employees felt they were part of something growing, and that feeling was reflected in the way they treated customers, distributors, and soda fountain owners. Little by little, Coca-Cola ceased to be just a product to become an organization, a system of people, processes, and resources oriented in the same direction. However, what is truly remarkable at this point in history is the combination of elements that Candler managed to articulate. On one hand, a singular product that he respected as the core of the business. On another, an aggressive strategy of commercial expansion. Along with that, a strong commitment to advertising and the creative use of promotional objects that made the logo omnipresent. And in addition, a disciplined management model with clear legal and operational structures. All of this resulted in sustained growth that led Coca-Cola to step outside the local circle and begin establishing itself as a drink known in more and more corners of the country. As the years passed, that initial vision of Candler would lay the foundation for even more ambitious moves that would go beyond soda fountains and enter the realm of mass distribution, bottling, and international expansion. But before reaching that point, the brand still needed to fully conquer the imagination of the North American consumer through new promotional ideas and an even broader presence, a field in which the company's commercial creativity would unfold with an intensity that would mark an era and set an example for generations of entrepreneurs. The explosion of modern marketing. By the end of the 19th century, while many companies continued to rely on endless blocks of text in newspapers and on overloaded posters promising miraculous cures for every kind of ailment, Coca-Cola was beginning to draw a completely different path, one that was far more intuitive and emotional, in which the drink stopped being presented as a pharmacy remedy and became an appetizing, refreshing, everyday experience. Asa Candler understood that the product was important, that the formula needed to be protected and kept stable, but he also understood that the real battlefield was beginning to be the minds of consumers, that invisible space where a brand can turn into an automatic reaction. You feel thirsty. You think of Coca-Cola. You need a break. You think of Coca-Cola. You walk into a store, and the first logo you remember is the one you saw on the calendar hanging on the barber's wall or on the side of a building near the station. In that stage, the company focused on using everyday objects as communication vehicles, an idea that seems obvious today, but at the time represented a way of thinking about business that was far ahead of its time. Calendars, for example, became an ideal medium for inserting the brand into people's daily lives. Each year, illustrated editions were distributed with pleasant scenes, landscapes, smiling families, elegant women, or moments of rest in which the Coca-Cola bottle or glass appeared almost naturally integrated, accompanied by the handwritten logo and simple phrases like delicious and refreshing. These calendars ended up hanging in kitchens, shops, offices, and workshops, staying there for 12 full months, reminding the owner and customers again and again that this drink existed and was available very close by. Something similar happened with wall clocks, metal trays, fans, store awnings, and even notebooks that the company commissioned with the printed brand. Each object found its place in a different environment, but all of them shared the same mission, reinforcing the link between Coca-Cola and the idea of a pleasant moment, simple and accessible to anyone who could pay a few cents. The brand infiltrated, silently but insistently, the spaces where people lived, worked, and relaxed, and that constant presence built a familiarity that, over time, would turn into trust. Another key step in this early burst of modern marketing was the simplification of the message. While advertisements for many medicines displayed entire paragraphs explaining supposed benefits, Coca-Cola opted for short, direct, and easy-to-remember slogans. Phrases like "drink Coca-Cola" or "delicious and refreshing" did not offer long explanations, but they invited action, suggesting an immediate and innocent pleasure. This way of communicating, concentrated in a few words that were repeated in posters, printed advertisements, and promotional materials, helped consolidate the brand's identity, because every time someone read those phrases, the mental association with the drink grew stronger. Candler and his team also understood that images could communicate something that words alone could not fully transmit. They began commissioning illustrations that showed people enjoying the drink in everyday scenes, from couples sharing a moment together to workers taking a break during their day. Instead of focusing on the ingredients or the origin of the syrup, The visual approach emphasized the emotional result, an expression of relief, a smile, a relaxed gesture. In this way, the brand gradually became associated with a lifestyle, with a way of understanding leisure time and consumption that moved away from the logic of the pharmacy and approached the territory of recreation, moderate pleasure, and sociability. The use of the brand on walls and building facades was another distinctive move of this phase. Coca-Cola paid shop owners and property owners to allow the logo and slogans to be painted in visible places, creating enormous outdoor advertisements that anticipated, in a way, what would become modern billboards decades later. In small towns, a painted wall with the brand was almost like a declaration of modernity, a symbol that this place was connected to the commercial current flowing from the big cities. In this way, the company not only gained visibility, but also positioned itself as part of progress, a powerful idea in a society that was beginning to fall in love with industrialization, railroads, and new distribution networks. At the same time, the company continued developing the tactic of free coupons, but now with a more structured logic, combining them with cross-promotions and agreements with soda fountains and shops. The model was clear: get as many people as possible to try the drink for the first time, trusting that the flavor and the experience would generate repetition. This strategy of "we hook them with the first try and keep them with the habit" is widely used today in digital products, but by the end of the 19th century, it was already being applied, intuitively, to a soft drink sold in glass cups. All this deployment was not without risk. Coca-Cola invested considerable amounts in advertising, production of promotional materials, and agreements with merchants, in exchange for a relatively small margin on each sale. But Candler knew that if he managed to occupy the consumer's minds strongly enough, volume would make the numbers very favorable in the medium and long term. This is one of the biggest learnings from this stage for anyone interested in entrepreneurship. The ability to think beyond immediate profit, to accept that for a period, it will be necessary to reinvest an important part of the income in building a solid, coherent, and omnipresent brand. As the 20th century approached, Coca-Cola's advertising began incorporating another nuance that would prove decisive: the idea that the drink was appropriate at almost any time of day. It was presented as a good companion for the morning, a refreshing option for the afternoon, and a pleasant choice during the night, always within a cheerful and familiar tone. This approach expanded the mental space the brand occupied because it did not restrict it to a specific use, but offered it as a constant in daily life. In this way, the company reduced seasonality and ensured that the product did not depend solely on summer heat or very specific situations. Little by little, all these coherent actions created what is now understood as a true branding system. Coca-Cola had a stable logo, a type of message repeated with discipline, a series of images and scenes that reinforced the same central idea, and enough distribution so that when desire arose, the consumer knew where to go to satisfy it. Without anyone naming it as such, one of the first great brand imaginaries in modern history was being built, a symbolic territory in which the drink occupied a very clear place, a small accessible pleasure associated with freshness, and a moment of pause within an increasingly accelerated society. As marketing advanced, the company began encountering a new reality: the growing interest of local entrepreneurs who wanted to participate in the business beyond the traditional soda fountain. Merchants and business owners from different regions were beginning to sense that this drink, so present in posters and painted walls, could move differently, reach more places, travel with people. That curiosity would open the door to a revolution in the distribution model that would completely change the scale of the business and would take the product, literally, much farther from the place where the original syrup was served. The bottling revolution. When the 20th century was just beginning to stretch awake, Coca-Cola was already a recognizable name in many cities of the southern region of the United States. It was served in soda fountains, it appeared on walls, calendars, and clocks, and it had earned a place in urban life. But it remained trapped in a very specific format: the glass prepared at the moment by an attendant behind a counter. The experience was pleasant, it was part of a social ritual, but it was limited by the physical space of the pharmacies and by the opening hours of those establishments. If you wanted Coca-Cola, you had to go to where Coca-Cola was, and that equation was beginning to fall short for a brand that aspired to become a constant companion in everyday life. In that context, two characters appeared, who looked at the business from a different perspective, with a mindset that mixed commercial instinct with boldness. Benjamin Thomas and Joseph Whitehead, both from Chattanooga, Tennessee. These lawyers, accustomed to negotiating, drafting contracts, and analyzing opportunities, perceived something that many overlooked. The drink was tied to a model of consumption that could be broken if a way was found to take it beyond the soda counter. The idea that began circulating in their minds was simple in its formulation and complex in its implementation. To bottle Coca-Cola and take it anywhere, there were people willing to refresh themselves, from small towns to rural areas far from the large cities. At that time, the bottling of soft drinks was not an absolute novelty, but it was far from being an efficient industrial system. Glass bottles were expensive, transportation was complicated, and the standards of hygiene and quality control were quite irregular. Even so, Thomas and Whitehead considered that the potential of Coca-Cola justified the effort of developing a bottling network specifically for the brand. They decided to present themselves before Asa Candler to propose something that, at the time, must have sounded almost outlandish: to obtain the exclusive rights to bottle and sell Coca-Cola in bottles throughout the entire United States. The meeting with Candler is one of those moments that seem minor when they occur, but that, with the perspective of time, acquire an almost legendary weight. The owner of the company was focused on growing the business through soda fountains and advertising. He was successful with that model, and he viewed with skepticism the idea of embarking on an additional venture that implied large investments in infrastructure, logistics, and control. For him, that glass of soda worked well as it was, and the bottling format seemed more like an obstacle than a lever for growth. However, he agreed to listen to the proposal and, after negotiations that history remembers as tense, he ended up ceding the bottling rights for a symbolic figure: $1. That contract, which at the time may have seemed almost irrelevant to Candler, opened the door to one of the most brilliant strategic moves in the Coca-Cola system, separating the concentrate business from the bottling business, keeping the original company focused on producing the syrup and delegating to franchisees the task of investing in plants, machinery, bottles, trucks, and distribution. Thomas and Whitehead, with those rights in hand, dedicated themselves to organizing the first major bottler in Chattanooga, and from there, to sub-franchising the model to other entrepreneurs who wanted to open plants in different regions. The first bottling plant operated with a level of effort that today seems almost artisanal, with rudimentary machines, very manual processes, and a considerable margin of error, but it represented a gigantic conceptual leap. For the first time, Coca-Cola could travel sealed, protected in a glass bottle, ready to be consumed far from the soda fountain. That meant that the drink could reach places where pharmacies with soda counters did not exist. It could be present at family picnics, in outdoor gatherings, in rural stations, and in small shops that would never have installed an equipped fountain, but could indeed sell cold bottles from a simple icebox. From the perspective of entrepreneurship, the model that was beginning to emerge here was almost a work of business engineering. The parent company focused on producing the concentrate with the secret formula. It sold that syrup to licensed bottlers, and these, in turn, mixed it with carbonated water, bottled it, organized distribution, and handled local marketing. Each part of the system specialized in what it did best, and the result was much faster growth than would have been possible if Coca-Cola had attempted to internally control the entire chain. The bottles, at first, did not yet have the iconic design that would arrive years later. They used relatively standard formats that resembled those of other soft drinks and similar products, which generated some confusion in the market, but even without a strong visual identity, the simple fact of being able to take the drink home or consume it outdoors transformed the way people connected with the brand. Coca-Cola stopped being associated exclusively with the moment of sitting at a counter and became a portable companion, capable of being present in a work lunch, in a break during field work, or on a train trip. This change required an enormous coordination effort. It was necessary to ensure that the product quality did not dilute with growth, that the proportions of syrup and water were correct in each plant, that the bottles were washed and reused with minimum hygiene standards, that prices stayed reasonably aligned, and that the consumer felt that the bottle purchased in a remote town had the same flavor as the glass served in a large city. To achieve this, Coca-Cola began developing manuals, inspections, and agreements with the bottlers that, over the years, would become one of the most sophisticated franchise systems in the world. The expansion through bottling had another very powerful side effect. It boosted the presence of the brand in small shops, general stores, neighborhood stores, and service stations that were beginning to appear with greater force. Every time a wooden crate full of bottles arrived at one of those places, the logo arrived as well on the boxes, on the signs, on the metal openers fixed to the wall, and on the advertisements the company provided so that merchants could decorate their establishments. The marketing that Candler had begun deploying with such enthusiasm now found a distribution platform that multiplied its impact, because behind every sign there could be a cold bottle within reach, and that combination of desire and availability is one of the most powerful engines in any consumer business. The bottlers, for their part, became entrepreneurs with their own skin within the Coca-Cola ecosystem. Each plant had to work with discipline to be profitable, negotiating with merchants, maintaining their equipment, investing in transportation, taking care of the relationship with the parent company, and at the same time adapting to the local realities of demand, prices, and competition. Some failed in the attempt, others prospered extraordinarily, but the model demonstrated a flexibility that allowed it to grow throughout the country without the central company having to assume the entire financial weight of expansion. As the bottles began to appear in more hands and more places, a new challenge emerged: imitations. Other companies began launching drinks with similar names, similar containers, and confusing promises, attempting to take advantage of the growing fame of Coca-Cola. This phenomenon, annoying for the company, revealed an unquestionable truth. The brand had become desirable enough for others to want to copy it. The response to that wave of imitators would lead the company to reflect much more deeply on the importance of the packaging design and the need for a bottle to be recognizable by touch, even in the darkness, as authentic, a step that would mark the next major evolution in Coca-Cola's differentiation strategy. The iconic bottle and the fight against imitators. At the beginning of the 20th century, when the bottling system had already spread through a large part of the United States, and crates full of Coca-Cola bottles were reaching towns that perhaps had never seen a soda fountain, a problem appeared that tends to repeat itself every time a brand begins to take off: the imitations. On shelves and counters, drinks with similar names, labels inspired by the company's style, and containers designed to be confused with those of Coca-Cola began to appear, all seeking to take advantage of the advertising effort the brand was making throughout the country. Some products were called Coca-Nola, Celery Cola, or Claco, and they deliberately played in that blurry territory where it was difficult for consumers to distinguish at first glance what they were actually buying. The situation was especially delicate because, at that time, the bottles used to package Coca-Cola did not have a distinctive shape. They were fairly common containers in the soft drink industry, with minimal variations in height or proportion. If someone walked into a store and saw several glass containers filled with dark, bubbly liquids, it was easy to make a mistake. Take another drink believing it was Coca-Cola, and after tasting it feel disappointed or think that the product had lost quality. That confusion damaged the brand's prestige, but at the same time, it showed that the name and concept were reaching a considerable level of notoriety, enough to inspire a whole generation of imitators who positioned themselves in the wake of the leader. The people in charge of Coca-Cola understood that legal actions, although necessary in certain cases, would not be enough to effectively protect the brand in every corner it was reaching. They could pursue the boldest companies in court, but the market was wide, changing, and full of small competitors who moved quickly. They needed something deeper, a tool that would act directly on consumer perception, something that would make it practically impossible to confuse an authentic bottle with any copy, even in low light or with a distracted glance. The answer to that challenge would not be a new advertisement, nor a clever slogan, but an industrial design conceived with surprising strategic clarity. In the year 1915, the company launched a contest among several glass factories to develop a bottle that would be unique, unmistakable, and capable of becoming a symbol as powerful as the handwritten logo itself. The assignment was clear, and at the same time very demanding. The container had to be so distinctive that a person could recognize it by touch, in the dark, or identify it by simply seeing its silhouette, even if it were shattered. The Root Glass Company factory, located in Terre Haute, Indiana, took on the challenge with special enthusiasm. One of its employees, Alexander Samuelson, along with designer Earl Dean and the plant's team, immersed themselves in the search for a shape that would meet the contest's requirements. History tells that Dean went to a library in search of inspiration and stopped at a botany book where the cacao fruit was illustrated, an elongated pod with vertical ridges and a natural curve that strongly caught the eye. Although Coca-Cola did not contain cacao in its formula, the image of that fruit became a creative spark. Based on that reference, the team began drawing a container with a narrow base, a rounded body, vertical lines, and a pronounced waist that created an elegant contour, and above all, something different from anything available on the market. The most important thing was not fidelity to a specific ingredient, but the creation of a memorable shape with its own personality. The result was the famous contour bottle, a bottle that seemed to have movement even while sitting still on a table, with a visual harmony that made the dark liquid inside feel almost like part of a design object rather than the simple content of a container. Its silhouette could be drawn from memory with relative ease, and this ability to stay in the mind became its greatest strength. The proposal from Root Glass Company won the contest, and Coca-Cola progressively began adopting this shape as its distinctive container, accompanied, of course, by the name embossed on the glass to reinforce the identity from every angle. From a business perspective, the impact of this decision was enormous. From the moment the iconic bottle was adopted as a standard, any attempt at imitation using generic containers was automatically relegated to a secondary visual position. The consumer who walked into a store wanting Coca-Cola did not need to read all the labels nor ask the clerk. It was enough to look for that curved silhouette and take it directly from the shelf. Even children began to identify the bottle as a desirable object, almost like a small glass treasure that felt good to hold. The container had ceased to be a simple vessel and became a central piece of the brand. The design of the bottle also offered advantages on other levels. It allowed the company to reinforce the perception of quality and care in the product, because conveying a certain elegance through the container helps justify, in the consumer's mind, choosing it over other more anonymous options. Additionally, the silhouette was so characteristic that it began appearing as the main feature in graphic advertising, in posters, calendars, and announcements where, in many cases, showing the bottle's shape alone, even without text, was enough for the message to be understood. It was one more step in building a complete brand image, name, logo, and container, working together as a coherent system that spoke the same aesthetic language. The company rushed to register the design and protect it legally, understanding that this container was no longer a simple functional element but one of its most valuable assets. From that point on, brand defense was not limited to the name Coca-Cola or the logo. It extended to the glass contour itself, which allowed action against imitators who sought to take advantage of that characteristic shape. In practical terms, this protection meant that any company attempting to launch a product with a bottle too similar could face a lawsuit for violating the registered design, something that discouraged many from trying. For bottlers, the arrival of the new bottle represented a challenge and an opportunity. The challenge consisted in adapting their equipment and processes to the container's specifications, which required specific molds and careful handling to avoid breakage, since the silhouette was more complex than standard containers. The opportunity was found in the commercial appeal generated by the new design. The bottles stood out on counters, caught the eye in wooden crates stacked in front of shops, and became a selling point on their own. Many consumers, in fact, began to associate the authenticity of Coca-Cola almost automatically with the presence of that specific bottle, becoming suspicious of any other presentation. As the decades passed, the contour bottle gained a kind of mythical aura. It appeared in family photographs, in movies, in magazine illustrations, and in all sorts of cultural contexts. It could be seen in the hands of workers, artists, soldiers, students, and that diversity of scenes reinforced the perception that Coca-Cola belonged to everyone, that its container was a democratic object that crossed social classes, professions, and lifestyles. Very few brands have managed to make the shape of their container recognizable to people who have never even seen a formal advertisement, and Coca-Cola achieved this largely thanks to that bold decision made in the year 1915. From the perspective of entrepreneurship and branding, what happened with Coca-Cola's iconic bottle teaches something that goes far beyond aesthetics. It proves the extent to which design can function as a silent language that differentiates, protects, and multiplies the value of a product in a saturated market. The company did not change its formula to defend itself from imitators. It changed the way it presented that formula to the world, and with that, ensured a privileged place in consumers' minds for generations. Molded glass became, in this way, a kind of shield and megaphone at the same time. With the brand strengthened, a growing network of bottlers, and a container that, by itself, communicated what product it was, Coca-Cola was ready to face an even greater challenge. To go beyond national borders, to accompany its consumers in key historical moments, and to turn that bottle, born to stand out on a shelf, into a symbol that would eventually travel to almost every corner of the planet. From American beverage to global symbol. At the beginning of the 20th century, when the contour bottle was starting to appear naturally in stores, bars, and train stations throughout the United States, the story of Coca-Cola was still, in essence, a domestic story, deeply tied to North American culture, to its growing cities, to its factories, and to that way of understanding consumption that combined modernity, industrialization, and popular leisure. But the world was becoming ever smaller thanks to the steamship, the telegraph, the new commercial routes, and an emerging sense of interconnectedness that pushed the most ambitious companies to look beyond their natural borders. In that context, the executives of Coca-Cola began asking themselves a key question from a business point of view. If the beverage worked so well in Atlanta, New York, or Chicago, why would it not find its place in Toronto, in Havana, or in any other city where people worked hard and also sought a simple moment of relief and freshness? The first international incursions occurred almost as natural extensions of commercial routes, taking advantage of geographic proximity and port connections. The brand began to appear in Canada, in Caribbean islands, in territories where the economic influence of the United States was especially strong, and little by little the network of bottlers adapted to the reality of other countries, with their own laws, their own customs, and their own business fabric. Bottling Coca-Cola outside the United States meant replicating the model that had worked so well at home, but it also required an enormous capacity for negotiation with local partners, who were the ones who knew the roads, the warehouses, the consumption habits, and the commercial opportunities of each region. In this way, the bottling franchise system acquired an international scale, and the contour bottle began to travel on ships and trains toward destinations that, for Pemberton, would have been almost pure science fiction. The First World War interrupted many commercial dynamics, altered routes, drained resources, and concentrated the world's attention on the battlefronts, although the brand continued consolidating itself in its main market. However, it would be during the Second World War that Coca-Cola would make a gigantic leap in its global projection. In a movement that combined logistics, patriotism, and a very refined understanding of how to build an emotional bond in the long term. When the United States entered the war, the company committed to ensuring that every soldier could drink a Coca-Cola for 5 cents, wherever he was stationed, whether in a base in Europe, on an island in the Pacific, or in any kind of outpost. This was not just a pretty phrase. It involved setting up bottling plants near the conflict zones, organizing supply chains under extreme circumstances, and collaborating with the army so that the beverage could reach the most remote possible place. While the soldiers fought, rested between missions, or gathered with their companions, the presence of the Coca-Cola bottle became a gesture of normality in the middle of chaos, a kind of small psychological bridge that connected them with their previous life, with their families, with their cities, and with that civilian world that seemed so distant during the war years. The company, by providing that experience of taste of home, was planting something that entrepreneurs understand very well, an emotional memory that would later transform into habitual consumption. When those young men returned to their countries, they would carry with them the memory of Coca-Cola, associated with moments of camaraderie, of pause, of comfort during harsh times, and that imprint does not fade easily. Furthermore, the bottling plants that were built to serve the soldiers did not disappear at the end of the conflict. Many were converted into production centers for the civilian market of the countries where they were located. In this way, when the war ended, Coca-Cola was not starting from zero in Europe or Asia, but already had facilities, trained workers, distribution channels, and, very importantly, a base of local consumers who had seen the beverage in the hands of the soldiers, who had tasted it out of curiosity, or who associated it with Reconstruction and with the arrival of modern products. In that post-war period, in which many cities were rebuilding themselves as best they could. The presence of the brand functioned as a symbol of openness, of connection with the outside world, of entry into an emerging global consumer culture. To consolidate itself in those new markets, the company had to develop a key skill: learning to be global without losing the ability to adapt to the local. In European countries, in Latin America, in Asia, or in Africa, Coca-Cola maintained its central formula and its brand identity, but adjusted nuances of communication, language, messages, and even distribution decisions to fit the culture of each place. In some regions, it presented itself as the modern beverage that accompanied the new urban middle class. In others, as a festive complement in celebrations and family gatherings. In others, as a symbol of youth and generational change. That work of cultural translation required sensitivity and collaboration with local teams, bottlers, and advertising agencies that understood the codes unique to each society. The brand, which in the United States already functioned as a kind of red thread connecting service stations, cinemas, stores, stadiums, and homes, began to occupy a similar place in other countries. It was possible to encounter the logo in a small Latin American grocery store, in a Parisian cafe, in a roadside stall in Africa, or in a Japanese restaurant, always accompanied by variations in decoration, in complementary colors, in the languages of the signs, but preserving the unmistakable core of its identity. This combination of coherence and flexibility is one of the great secrets of its expansion. The brand was the same everywhere, but it did not present itself as a foreign body that descended from outside, but as a guest trying to learn the local language. As the years went by, the presence of Coca-Cola in historical moments became so frequent that, in many iconic photographs of the 20th century, in black and white or in faded color, a bottle, a sign, or a vending machine appears in a corner of the frame. Cultural demonstrations, sporting celebrations, concerts, popular festivities, and everyday scenes of growing cities began sharing space with the characteristic red and the curve of the logo. The beverage became, then, something larger than a simple soda. It transformed into a symbol of a certain idea of modernity, of urban lifestyle, of mass culture that crossed borders and settled both in advertising and in the collective imagination. This process, however, was not free of tensions and criticisms. In some places, the expansion of the brand was perceived as a form of North American cultural influence, a liquid ambassador of economic and social values that not everyone accepted enthusiastically. Debates arose about cultural homogenization, about the impact of multinational companies on local shops, and about the balance between the adoption of global products and the preservation of local identities. The company had to deal with that perception, seeking ways to integrate itself into local festivities, support community events, or adapt its communication so as not to appear as a foreign entity that swept away everything in its path. From the business perspective, the leap of Coca-Cola from national beverage to global symbol leaves several lessons of great value. In the first place, it shows the importance of building replicable systems. The model of concentrate and franchised bottlers allowed the brand to reach very different places without the parent company having to build each operation from scratch. In the second place, it teaches that geographic expansion is not only a logistical matter but, above all, a cultural one. It requires learning to listen, to observe, and to adjust messages without betraying the heart of the brand. And in the third place, it makes clear that many opportunities are born in moments of crisis or great historical change, such as wars or reconstruction periods, where companies capable of thinking in the long term can transform difficult decisions into lasting strategic advantages. With a global network in full expansion, bottling plants spread across various continents, and an increasingly common presence in the daily life of millions of people, Coca-Cola was in a privileged position to take the next step that would be fundamental, managing with greater sophistication the narrative surrounding the brand, taking advantage of new media, from radio to television, and using memorable campaigns to consolidate that image of a beverage associated with happy moments, with shared encounters, and with a type of optimism that would end up defining a large part of the 20th century. The golden era of advertising, when the map of the world began to fill with bottling plants, red signs, and contour bottles stacked in wooden crates, Coca-Cola understood that the next decisive territory was no longer logistics, but storytelling. that symbolic space in which a brand stops being a product and becomes part of the emotional landscape of an era. The 20th century moved forward with radios turned on in living rooms, illustrated magazines passing from hand to hand, and later, televisions that became the center of family attention, and the company understood that these new media were not merely channels for showing a bottle, but platforms for building an idea of life in which their beverage was deeply integrated. During the years of the Great Depression, when the United States was going through one of its most difficult stages, Coca-Cola's advertising began to insist on a simple but powerful notion: the pause. The drink was presented as a small break within endless workdays, a moment of respite that required no great luxuries, only a few coins and a few minutes of tranquility. From there came concepts such as the pause that refreshes, which connected with a tired and worried public in need of signs of normality. The company did not pretend it could solve the country's economic problems, but it offered a modest and honest promise. While everything was shaking, that flavor, that sensation of freshness when touching ice, remained. At the same time, graphic advertisements began to refine a visual style that combined aspirational everyday scenes with careful elegance. Office workers resting beside a vending machine, young people at a skating rink, couples sharing a bottle on a park bench appeared, always with open smiles and an atmosphere of social harmony that, in many cases, contrasted with the harshness of reality, but functioned as a kind of ideal to aspire to. The brand was gradually being associated with that improved version of daily life, without extravagance, with a discreet brightness that conveyed the feeling that, despite everything, there was still room for small pleasures. With the arrival of radio, Coca-Cola's presence left the exclusively visual terrain and settled into the ears of millions of people. Catchy jingles, mentions in popular programs, sponsorships of entertainment and sports segments began to weave a sound network that linked the brand with familiar voices, cheerful melodies, and moments shared at home around the radio. Advertising was no longer limited to the instant someone saw a street sign. It infiltrated the domestic environment, accompanying conversations, laughter, and silences. From the perspective of entrepreneurship, it was about taking advantage of every new technology and turning it into a stage to represent again and again the same central idea: Coca-Cola as a companion to pleasant moments. One of the most celebrated milestones of this stage was the consolidation of the figure of Santa Claus, dressed in red, with a white beard and a kindly air, which today seems like an ancient tradition, but was largely fixed in the collective mind thanks to Coca-Cola's Christmas campaigns beginning in the decade of 1930. The company commissioned illustrations in which the character appeared resting with a bottle, visiting homes, sharing the beverage with children and adults in a warm and festive environment. Those images, reproduced in posters, magazines, and calendars, finished linking the brand's characteristic red with the Christmas imagination, to the point of making Coca-Cola an inseparable part of the season's aesthetic. Transforming a religious and cultural celebration into a recurring stage for the brand was a masterstroke that amplified its presence almost inevitably. Every December, millions of people saw those advertisements, and the bottle became part of the iconography of wonder, gifts, and reunion. With the end of the Second World War and the beginning of an era of prosperity in many countries, television became the great window to the world, and with it, advertising took a leap in intensity. Coca-Cola knew how to adapt to that medium by creating advertisements that combined music, brief stories, and carefully choreographed scenes to convey energy, youth, and camaraderie. Families sitting in front of the television saw groups of young people on beaches, at parties, at concerts, sharing glass bottles, laughing, dancing, and that representation of happy life became almost automatically associated with the brand. The drink was no longer only refreshing, it was part of the visual script of what a good moment should look like. As societies changed, especially during the decades of 1960 and 1970, with youth movements, civil rights struggles, and new cultural sensibilities, Coca-Cola tried to adjust its message to remain relevant. An emblematic example of this effort was the campaign, "It is the real thing," and, especially, the advertisement in which a group of young people from different parts of the world gathered on a hill to sing, "I would like to buy the world a Coke." That piece effectively condensed several ideas: diversity, unity, peace, harmony, and in the middle of it all, the Coca-Cola bottle as the common element that brought them together. The brand presented itself as a shared language in a world that aspired to understand itself better, and the song remained in the collective memory as one of the great moments of 20th century advertising. In parallel, the company continued exploring other communication spaces, such as sporting events, industrial fairs, graphic campaigns in international magazines, and collaborations with major entertainment figures. Sports, in particular, became a fertile terrain for reinforcing the idea of energy and vitality. Sponsorships of competitions, presence in stadiums, vending machines in sports facilities, and advertisements linking the beverage with physical effort and the rest that followed helped consolidate Coca-Cola's image as part of the ritual of sporting spectacle. Every goal, every basket, every victory could be accompanied by a toast with a bottle, and that emotional bond strengthened with each season. The key to this golden era of advertising was the brand's ability to create a coherent style over time, yet flexible enough to adapt to new generations. It did not repeat exactly the same scenes, but maintained a constant core. Shared moments, moderate joy, optimism, a sense of belonging to something greater. The logo, the bottle, the colors, and the slogans changed in tone, but always pointed to the idea that Coca-Cola was there when people gathered, celebrated, traveled, or simply tried to make routine life more bearable. From the perspective of entrepreneurship, this stage demonstrates the power of investing in storytelling consistently, not as a one-time action to boost sales, but as a long-term strategy to occupy an emotional space in the customer's life. Coca-Cola understood that people do not fall in love with a product solely because of its chemical composition, but because of the stories surrounding it, because of what it represents when it appears on a table, in a photograph, or in an advertisement seen again and again over the years. And that understanding allowed them to remain relevant even when the market began to fill with aggressive competitors, offering similar flavors and comparable prices. Over time, this dominance of narrative would face new challenges: changes in consumer concerns, a growing sensitivity toward health, the emergence of sugar-free alternatives, and increasingly direct competition from other brands that began to dispute the terrain of youth, modernity, and spectacle. From that moment on, the company would have to learn to play a different and more complex game, in which it was no longer enough to be the iconic beverage of good moments, but necessary to respond to new market demands without losing the essence that had made it famous. Diets, diversification, and the Cola Wars. When the second half of the 20th century began to take shape, with newly inaugurated shopping centers, color televisions glowing in millions of homes, and a society that was starting to become familiar with the word consumption as part of its daily identity, Coca-Cola found itself in a curious situation. It was the dominant brand, the reference point, the drink that symbolized a certain way of living, yet at the same time profound changes were beginning to appear in people's habits, in health concerns, and, above all, in the types of messages that resonated with the new generations. The company continued appearing in bright signs, in stadiums, and in heartwarming campaigns, but the playing field was no longer a comfortable promenade and was becoming a strategic battleground in which every decision mattered. One of the first major transformations came from society itself, which began to view food differently. As the 1950s and 1960s progressed, medical and cultural discussions emerged, highlighting calorie excess, obesity, and the need to take care of one's figure, especially in a context where urban and sedentary lifestyles were becoming more common. Magazines talked about diets, celebrities commented on their exercise routines, food brands began releasing light versions of their products, and sugar, which for decades had been synonymous with pleasure, started to be seen as something that ought to be moderated. In that scenario, a sugary soft drink, no matter how iconic, began to face more critical scrutiny. Coca-Cola understood that if it wanted to keep a privileged place on the table and in the refrigerator of consumers, it needed to offer alternatives to those who desired the flavor and experience of the brand, but without the full caloric load of the classic version. From that reasoning came, after various tests and preliminary moves, one of the most consequential decisions in its product history: the introduction of diet variants. First came limited, targeted options, but the great milestone was the appearance of Diet Coke, or Coca-Cola Light in many markets. a drink formulated to maintain a flavor profile close to the original using sweeteners instead of traditional sugar. This launch represented not only a chemical and flavor innovation, but also a declaration of intent. The brand was willing to fragment itself, to stop depending on a single flagship product, and to open a range of options designed for different consumer profiles. At the same time, the company continued expanding its portfolio beyond cola itself. Fanta, which had had a peculiar origin during wartime, began consolidating as a family of fruit-flavored soft drinks, especially strong in certain European and Latin American countries. Sprite, with its citrus character and its image associated with clean freshness, started to occupy the segment of those who sought something different from the traditional dark caramel drink. Later came other products, from lemon-flavored beverages to iced tea variants, all with a clear logic. Leave no empty spaces on store shelves, respond to the increasing segmentation of the market, and build an ecosystem of brands in which Coca-Cola acted as a banner, but not as the only protagonist. Parallel to these internal developments, the competitive environment was becoming increasingly intense. Pepsi, which had been present for decades as a relevant competitor, decided to position itself with renewed aggressiveness, betting on a clearly youth-oriented approach. Its famous Pepsi generation presented the brand as the natural choice for those who wanted to distance themselves from what was established, from what their parents had drunk, and it evolved into a narrative in which Pepsi appeared linked to pop music, entertainment, and the stars of the moment. That rivalry stopped being a simple coexistence of two similar products in the same category and became what the world would end up calling the Cola Wars, an advertising and strategic confrontation that defined an entire era. This competition had profound consequences on how Coca-Cola managed its own marketing and product strategy. The company could no longer rest on its condition as the undisputed classic, because each Pepsi campaign pushed it to review its messages, explore new formats, sponsor events, and fight for privileged advertising spaces. Advertisements became more dynamic, associations with film, music, and sports stars multiplied, and the public watched from their sofas, a constant tug-of-war in which both brands tried to present themselves as the indispensable drink of youth, of intense moments, of great experiences. The key for Coca-Cola was maintaining that delicate balance between tradition and modernity. On one hand, its greatest strength lay in a history full of memories, in the emotional connection with entire generations who had grown up seeing its advertisements and sharing its bottles at all kinds of events. On the other hand, the risk of being associated solely with the classic could make it appear, in the eyes of teenagers and young adults of the 1970s and 1980s, as something tied to the past. To avoid that trap, the company began adapting its visual language, its music, its slogans, trying to speak naturally in the idiom of each era without losing that small touch of timelessness that distinguished it. A direct consequence of this stage was the exponential growth of the budget allocated to marketing, market research, and experimentation with new flavors, packaging formats, and presentations. Smaller cans were introduced, bottles of different sizes, variants with flavor adjustments to satisfy regional preferences, and campaigns directed at specific segments, from families to urban youth. The company was already behaving like a global giant that, despite its size, tried to react quickly to changes in the environment, relying on studies, surveys, and consumer tests that sought to detect trends before they fully consolidated. In this climate of fierce competition, comparative taste tests became a media phenomenon. Some campaigns organized or leveraged by Pepsi, in which participants were asked to choose between two unmarked cola cups, produced results that made Coca-Cola executives nervous because a significant portion of respondents preferred the slightly sweeter taste of the competitor in those immediate tests. This, which could be interpreted as just another detail in the advertising war, began to seep into the company's internal perception, fueling the idea that perhaps the formula, considered almost sacred for decades, should be adjusted to align with the changing tastes of the public. From an entrepreneurial logic, this is a fascinating turning point. A company that has built its empire on a strong identity, a recognizable flavor, and a long history faces data suggesting that the market might be leaning toward another product profile. Faced with that scenario, the temptation to innovate radically grows, but so does the risk of touching the very heart of the brand. The pressure to respond to the competition, to prove that it could lead on all fronts, led the organization to consider changes that, until then, had been unthinkable. Thus, while Diet Coke cans gained space in refrigerators, while the beverage portfolio opened like a fan, and while the advertising war with Pepsi became increasingly visible in the streets, in stadiums, and in the media, a decision was beginning to take shape in the offices of Coca-Cola, one that would take the brand's history into one of its most controversial stages. A decision in which the attempt to adapt to the apparent taste of the consumer would test, as never before, the emotional bond between the company and the people who had chosen that drink throughout their entire lives. New Coke, the mistake that made history. In the middle of the 1980s, after decades of almost uncontested leadership and after years of an intense advertising war with Pepsi, the leadership of Coca-Cola lived in a sort of permanent tension between pride and concern, because on one hand they were still the historical reference, the icon that had accompanied several generations, but on the other hand they saw how market studies and the famous blind taste tests were beginning to show cracks in that confidence, with apparently too many consumers leaning toward a slightly sweeter, smoother flavor profile that favored their great rival in those quick tests that were organized in shopping centers and public squares. The meetings in Atlanta were filled with graphs, percentages, and data interpretations that seemed to say the same thing. The world was changing, and the formula that had endured for decades might no longer fit as well with the preferences of the contemporary consumer, accustomed to more intense initial flavors, with less bitterness and a more direct sweetness suitable for the short sip that is taken in a tasting. That context made the company's leadership begin to consider something that for a long time had been almost sacred, an untouchable territory within the internal imagination, modifying the original Coca-Cola recipe with the objective of adjusting it to the results of those tests, and anticipating, in an aggressive way, what they interpreted as a consolidated trend in the public's taste. The development process of the new formula was long, meticulous, and from a technical point of view, impeccable according to the standards of the time. The research teams tested hundreds of variations, combined levels of sweetness, acidity, and body, and carried out large-scale consumer tests in which thousands of people compared the classic flavor, the Pepsi flavor, and the new recipe that Coca-Cola was fine-tuning in secret. In those experiments, the new version achieved spectacular results, surpassing both the traditional flavor and the competitor's flavor, which fueled in the leadership the conviction that they had in their hands a necessary update, a sort of evolution that would maintain the company's leadership for the following decades. With that confidence, the company made a decision that is still studied today in business schools as one of the most daring moves in the history of marketing, to withdraw the original formula from the market and replace it entirely with the new recipe, which would be launched under the name New Coke. Instead of offering it as an additional variant, they decided that the change would be total, as if one chapter were closing forever and the next were beginning with a clean page. The official announcement, made in April of 1985, was presented as a historic occasion, as the beginning of a new era for the brand, with executives smiling before the cameras and a tone that mixed technological pride with commercial confidence. In the first days, the numbers seemed to prove them right. The initial sales of New Coke were solid, in many places even higher than those of the previous product, driven by curiosity, the enormous communication campaign, and the sheer strength of the brand, which managed to lead millions of consumers to try the novelty. The quick surveys continued to indicate that, in an immediate sip, the new flavor pleased many people, who perceived it as smoother, less harsh in the aftertaste, more aligned with that sweet profile that had become fashionable. In the central offices, for a few days, there was a sense of relief, as if the calculations had been confirmed and the leap into the void was working. However, something deeper, something that did not appear in the graphs or in the percentage tables, began to manifest almost immediately somewhere else. The emotions of loyal consumers, those who for decades had associated the original Coca-Cola flavor with specific memories, with moments from their childhood, with personal and family rituals. For that segment, the problem was not whether the new recipe tasted good or less good, but rather the feeling of loss, of rupture with a part of their own daily biography. Within days, letters, phone calls, complaints in local media, and messages from people who said they felt betrayed, surprised, and disoriented began arriving when they discovered that what they had consumed all their lives no longer existed on the shelves. The reactions were especially intense in certain states of the southern region of the United States, where Coca-Cola was deeply intertwined with regional identity. Groups of upset consumers were organized, signatures were collected demanding the return of the original formula, and the media began covering the story with a tone halfway between disbelief and fascination, because it was not common to see such a powerful company facing a wave of emotional rejection so clear. Headlines appeared that spoke of nostalgia, of cultural heritage, of the sensation that something had been altered that went beyond a simple mass consumption product. Meanwhile, in Atlanta, the leadership observed how the situation became more chaotic as the weeks passed. The sales numbers were not disastrous, but the noise in public opinion was growing. There was an evident disconnection between the cold data of the taste tests and the emotional reality of the market. Many consumers accepted the new recipe without much drama, but a very visible, vocal, and media-active fraction was not willing to give up the flavor they associated with their personal history. It became a living lesson of something that today is repeated constantly. People do not buy only a product, but what that product represents in their life. In that climate of tension, the company had to face a decision that required a considerable dose of corporate humility, acknowledging that they had been wrong. After less than 3 months since the launch, and after receiving tens of thousands of calls and letters, the leadership of Coca-Cola announced in July of 1985 the return of the original formula to the market, under the name Coca-Cola Classic, while New Coke would continue to exist for a time as a parallel option. The press conference in which this reversal was communicated was experienced as a historic moment opposite to that of the launch. It was no longer a celebration of innovation, but a kind of public correction, an admission that the emotional bond with the brand had been underestimated. The return of the classic recipe was received with a mix of relief, enthusiasm, and a certain taste of victory among the consumers who had raised their voices. In some places, the first batches of Coca-Cola Classic sold out within hours, and almost festive scenes occurred in shops and supermarkets where customers celebrated the return of their flavor. Curiously, and in a way difficult to foresee, this entire episode had a paradoxical effect. It strengthened even more the mythical character of the original formula, because people felt that they had fought for it and had regained it, and that sense of belonging increased the symbolic value of the brand. From the perspective of entrepreneurship, the case of New Coke has become a classic example of how excessive concentration on certain indicators can lead to decisions that ignore invisible but fundamental dimensions of a business. The taste tests measured immediate preferences, but they did not measure memory, identity, tradition, all those layers that build over decades of constant presence in people's lives. The company had interpreted the data with an impeccable rational logic and yet misread the emotional bond it had created, precisely thanks to the consistency of its product for almost a century. The enormous difference between what the surveys said and what happened afterward demonstrated something that is still a valid warning today. There are brands whose strength does not reside only in what they offer in the present, but in what they represent as continuity, as a thread that connects generations. Changing that core abruptly can be much more dangerous than any campaign from the competition. The decision to restore the original formula, far from being a definitive defeat, became an act that showed a capacity for listening and adjustment, something that, with time, helped the company emerge from the reputational crisis with the lesson learned. From that moment on, Coca-Cola would understand more clearly that its future would not depend on altering the essence of its emblematic product, but on multiplying the ways of being present in people's lives through variants, sponsorships, global events, and an increasingly sophisticated presence in the major cultural and sporting stages where the entire world would turn its attention. Sponsorships, events, and cultural power. When the storm of New Coke was left behind and the classic formula returned to its place on store shelves, the company understood much more clearly that its strength did not depend only on what was inside the bottle, but on the stage where that bottle appeared again and again before the eyes of the world. The century was moving forward with global sports broadcasts, massive concerts, and large events that concentrated the attention of millions of people. And in that new media landscape, supporting the brand with simple advertisements between programs was no longer enough. It was necessary to be inside the moments that people would remember years later, in the same picture, in the same shot, in the same collective memory. The Olympic Games, for example, became one of the great temples where the brand decided to anchor its presence. Every 4 years, athletes from all corners of the planet marched under their flags, while television cameras captured images that would be repeated in news programs, documentaries, and historical archives. Associating the red and white logo with that ritual of effort, excellence, and unity among countries was a masterstroke, because it placed the drink in a context that transcended the simple act of refreshing oneself. In the Olympic venues, posters, stands, vending machines, and brand activations appeared, integrating into the spectator's experience both in the stadiums and on home screens. The medals belonged to the athletes, but the visual context surrounding those triumphs often carried the unmistakable seal of Coca-Cola. Something similar happened with the World Football Championships and other massive competitions. The matches that paralyzed countries, the celebrations in the streets, the images of fans hugging after a decisive goal were captured by cameras that inevitably also recorded advertising boards, illuminated panels, bottles in the hands of supporters, and a whole series of elements that reinforced the feeling that the brand was there where something big was happening. For millions of people, those childhood and youth memories in which their national team played a final or achieved a historic qualification came accompanied, even in the background, by the characteristic red in the stadium, on the screen, or in the celebrations that followed. The strategy was not limited to sports, as music became one of the main engines of popular culture, with festivals, international tours, and massive concerts. The company began to integrate itself into that universe of lights, sound, and intense emotions, sponsoring tours of famous artists, supporting summer festivals, appearing in settings where young people from different countries gathered to sing the same songs, helped reinforce an idea the company had cultivated for decades. The drink, as part of a shared moment. In the minds of those attending these events, buying a cold bottle during the concert break was not an isolated act but part of the complete ritual of living the experience. Behind these moves was a very clear business mindset. In a world saturated with advertising messages, the most powerful memory is not that of the advertisement that interrupts, but that of the brand that accompanies without imposing itself, that is present when a happy memory is being created. The company allocated enormous resources to identifying which events had that capacity to gather diverse audiences, to become cultural milestones, and it designed specific strategies to be there at the right moment. Sometimes the prominence was more obvious, with large logos and dedicated campaigns. Other times it was built through discreet repetition, with machines, signage, and small gestures that slowly sank in over time. In many countries, the presence of Coca-Cola in popular festivities, carnivals, regional fairs, and local celebrations also became part of the social fabric. Decorated trucks accompanying parades, stages for performances in town squares, sponsorships of contests, uniforms for modest neighborhood teams. All of this built a very fine network that connected the brand not only with major televised events, but with the small everyday traditions of each community. For an entrepreneur observing this story, it becomes clear how this combination between macro and micro, between major global sponsorships and local support, ends up creating a rooted presence difficult for less consistent competitors to replicate. Vending machines, for their part, became true urban icons. Installing a machine with the red logo in a train station, a university campus, a hospital, or a factory meant, in a certain way, planting a silent flag in that space. The people who passed by daily, who bought a can early in the morning or during a late-night study session, began integrating that presence into their mental map of the place. Over the years, many of those machines became almost part of the emotional furniture of their users, especially in environments like schools or offices, where certain consumption rituals repeated themselves over months and years. On the other hand, the brand invested in collaboration formats that sought to generate conversation beyond simple consumption. Special editions of commemorative containers, collections of cans dedicated to sports or cultural events, designs linked to host countries, invited artists who reinterpreted the logo. All of this helped renew public perception without breaking the visual essence that had always accompanied the brand. Each new global campaign tried to balance surprise and familiarity, playing with people's imagination while always keeping the core identity recognizable. An especially interesting aspect of this stage is the way Coca-Cola began speaking about intangible values in its communication. The slogans no longer focused solely on freshness or flavor, but appealed to concepts like sharing, uniting, enjoying together, celebrating diversity, living the moment. In practice, the company was attempting to position the drink as a kind of common language in increasingly fragmented societies, as a symbolic meeting point where different generations, cultures, and lifestyles could come together. The simple gesture of raising a bottle or a can in a toast was used as a metaphor for connection between people. Of course, this entire deployment of sponsorships and partnerships was not free from economic calculation. Every contract, every presence in a stadium or festival responded to an analysis of return, visibility, and positioning. But as the years passed, the accumulated result went beyond the sum of individual campaigns. The brand settled into the collective memory as something more than a product. It became part of the backdrop of public life, a recurring element in the images that defined the decades. When someone remembered a World Football Championship, an Olympic final, a legendary concert, or even certain neighborhood festivities, it was common for that mental scene to also include that specific red, that typography, that bottle with its recognizable curves. From the perspective of entrepreneurship, this cultural dimension of the business teaches that the true power of a brand arrives when it stops speaking only about itself and becomes integrated into narratives that exceed it. Coca-Cola did not try to take center stage at the Olympic Games, the World Championships, or the concerts. It sought to be the drink that stood beside those moments. That nuance, which may seem small, makes an enormous difference. The brand does not compete with the event, it joins it. And that desire to accompany has allowed the company to remain present even as tastes, technologies, and entertainment formats have changed. However, as the logo became omnipresent and the company consolidated itself as one of the great symbols of global capitalism, a more critical view began to grow within certain sectors of society. The same presence that meant joy and celebration for many was beginning to be associated by others with excesses, health problems, and social and environmental impacts that could not be ignored forever. At that point, image building alone was no longer enough, and the company would have to face more uncomfortable questions about the real cost of that brilliant success. Criticism, health, and controversies. As the final decades of the 20th century advanced and the new millennium made its way with omnipresent screens, global information networks, and a society far more aware of what it ate and drank, the figure of Coca-Cola began to be examined with a different lens, more demanding, almost relentless at times. The same brand that for decades had been a symbol of shared joy and everyday modernity began to appear, with increasing frequency, in public health reports, televised debates, journalistic articles, and documentaries that questioned the role of sugary soft drinks in problems such as obesity, diabetes, and other metabolic disorders. The climate had changed. Consumption was no longer only an expression of freedom. It had also become a matter of responsibility. In many countries, data showing increases in weight among children and adults generated a strong debate about the kinds of products that were filling refrigerators, fast food restaurant menus, and vending machines in schools and sports centers. Sugary drinks often appeared at the center of the discussion, and within that group, because of its size, visibility, and history, Coca-Cola became almost automatically the focal point. While the company continued speaking of happiness, pause, and shared moments, a part of society began to ask with growing insistence what consequences might arise from consuming with such ease products that provided a large amount of calories without truly satisfying hunger. The questioning was not limited to the composition of the product. Attention was also placed on the marketing strategies used for decades, especially regarding the presence of the brand in environments considered sensitive, such as schools or programs aimed at children. Activists, doctors, parent associations, and public health agencies pointed out that by constantly associating the drink with animated characters, school events, promotions for young people, and an imagery of innocent fun, entire generations were being encouraged to normalize the daily consumption of sugary soft drinks as part of their regular diet. In some countries, this type of debate led to restrictions on advertising directed at minors and to the progressive removal of certain machines and sponsorships in school centers. In parallel, several governments began to propose specific fiscal measures, such as taxes on sugary beverages, with the aim of discouraging consumption and generating resources for health systems and prevention programs. Each time a country proposed or approved this type of tax, the name of Coca-Cola reappeared in headlines, not only as one more company in the sector, but as the most recognizable face of that category of products. The company was forced to respond, in some cases opposing, in others negotiating, and almost always attempting to explain its position in terms of individual choice, balance in the diet, and varied options for the consumer. Amid this climate, the company moved more quickly toward diversifying its portfolio into drinks with less or no sugar, waters, teas, low-calorie options, and products that could be presented as lighter alternatives. However, there was an evident tension. The brand that had built its identity around an iconic formula loaded with sugar needed now to demonstrate that it understood the concerns of a generation that read labels, consulted nutritional information, and questioned the constant presence of soft drinks in its daily life. Advertising campaigns began incorporating messages about portion sizes, responsible consumption, and informed choice, a narrative clearly different from that of previous decades. Additionally, the company faced criticism related to other aspects of its activity in different parts of the world. In some countries, there were denunciations of precarious labor conditions or labor union conflicts in bottling plants, which generated protests, calls for boycotts, and pressure campaigns by social organizations and human rights advocates. Although each case had its own nuances and different contexts, the effect on the global reputation of the brand was cumulative. For certain sectors, Coca-Cola ceased to be only the cheerful symbol of the red bottle and became a visible example of the ethical dilemmas that large multinational corporations face when their operations extend into regions with very disparate labor and social frameworks. Another sensitive point was the use of water in certain communities. As concern for natural resources grew more intense, and different parts of the planet suffered droughts and water stress, voices multiplied questioning bottling plants located in areas where the local population perceived that access to water was becoming more difficult or more expensive. Reports, investigations, and protests pointed to the company in particular places, accusing it of consuming scarce resources for the benefit of a product that, in the eyes of its critics, was not a basic necessity. The company had to respond with its own studies, compensation programs, initiatives to return to the environment, equivalent volumes of water, and collaborative projects with communities. But the discussion left a mark that was difficult to erase. The symbolic dimension of Coca-Cola played a double role here. On one hand, its enormous visibility made it an easy target. Any failure, conflict, or negative impact associated with its name quickly found media resonance and spread rapidly. On the other hand, that same visibility forced the company to react, revise policies, and assume public commitments more ambitious than those of smaller or less well-known companies. In terms of brand management, the challenge was enormous. How to maintain the narrative of joy and togetherness while responding in a minimally credible way to demands related to health, the environment, and working conditions. During this period, corporate communication began incorporating concepts such as social responsibility, programs to support local communities, educational initiatives, and projects promoting active lifestyles. Campaigns were developed encouraging consumers to combine the drink with physical exercise. Messages were launched about the importance of a balance between calories consumed and calories expended, and the company attempted to present itself as part of the solution to modern challenges, not only as a source of problems. However, in the mind of a part of public opinion, the question continued to linger. To what extent were these actions genuine commitments, and to what extent were they part of a strategy to preserve the image of the brand in a world increasingly critical? For those observing this story through the lens of entrepreneurship, this phase of Coca-Cola serves as a very clear reminder that prolonged success brings with it a second layer of responsibility. As a brand grows, it is no longer enough to make a product that people like and sell it effectively. The impact of each decision on health, the environment, and communities becomes part of the balance that society draws about the company. Reputation no longer depends solely on the quality of the soft drink, but on the accumulated perception of how the company behaves regarding complex issues, those in which there are no quick answers or perfect solutions. What is interesting is that, amid these tensions, Coca-Cola could not afford to withdraw or lower its profile. Its business model depended precisely on being present, on continuing to appear at events, stores, screens, and conversations. It was a giant force to learn to move under spotlights that illuminated both its achievements and its contradictions, and, over time, it understood that many of the questions that arose around health, water, and the physical environment were connected to a broader concern, one that would end up occupying a central place in the public agenda: the future of the planet and the need to rethink the way we produce, consume, and manage the waste from everything we buy. Water, sustainability, and reputation at stake. When the new century began to gain speed, with daily headlines about global warming, droughts, pollution, and the melting of places that had once seemed unchangeable, Coca-Cola discovered that its name was beginning to appear in conversations very different from those of previous decades. Conversations in which people no longer spoke about holiday commercials, or sports sponsorships, or heartwarming campaigns, but about liters of water, tons of plastic, environmental footprint, and the responsibility that large companies have in a planet that shows signs of exhaustion. The brand that for such a long time had symbolized an idea of abundance and carefree consumption suddenly found itself observed through the lens of sustainability, a lens that does not forgive inconsistencies and that forces the complete revision of every link in the value chain. Water became one of the first points of friction. The business model of Coca-Cola, based on an immense network of bottling plants distributed around the world, depends directly on the availability of drinking water, not only to produce the beverage, but also to clean, wash, refrigerate, and keep running the machinery that sustains the system. In regions where water resources were abundant, this reality went unnoticed. But in areas with increasing water stress, where local populations watched wells drop and droughts become more frequent, the presence of a beverage plant could be perceived as a threat, as an actor competing for the same basic resource that farmers and families needed. Neighborhood protests, investigative articles, and questioning from environmental organizations began to point to specific cases in which excessive water consumption or negative impacts on local aquifers were being denounced. Although each situation had its nuances and the company defended its numbers and its practices, the accumulated effect on its reputation was evident. For a portion of public opinion, Coca-Cola began to be associated, in addition to soft drinks and sponsorships, with the question of whether the world could afford to continue sustaining resource-intensive models in the middle of a climate crisis. The symbol of the cold and condensed bottle, which once evoked only pleasure, began to blend with the image of a well running out of water. Faced with that scenario, the company was forced to consider strategies that were not merely reactive. It began to speak openly about objectives related to efficient water use, about projects to improve water management in its plants, about programs aimed at returning to nature or to communities volumes equivalent to those used in production through reforestation initiatives, watershed protection, wetlands restoration, or improvements in infrastructure for accessing drinking water. In parallel, audits, certifications, and collaborations with non-governmental organizations and technical bodies were promoted with the intention of demonstrating that the discourse went beyond slogans. However, public perception never changes solely with reports, because the debate about water is connected to something very visceral, to the direct experience of those who see their environment change, and to the sense of justice or injustice associated with the distribution of such a basic resource. This is why, even when the company presented progress and results, it continued facing criticism in certain places, where the presence of its logo had become a visible reminder of the tensions between global businesses and local needs. The symbolic weight of the brand, which had brought it so many benefits in the field of marketing, worked against it here. Any conflict was immediately amplified. At the same time, a second battle was becoming increasingly evident, and this time it had to do with what surrounds the liquid, with the container. The returnable glass bottles that had defined much of the 20th century had long coexisted with aluminum cans and, above all, with lightweight plastic bottles that allowed cheaper and more convenient distribution, but that also fueled the growing mountain of waste that the world did not know how to manage properly. Images of beaches filled with trash, rivers and seas overwhelmed by containers, animals trapped in plastic, moved global consciousness. And in many of those photographs, a red label could be clearly seen, a logo recognizable even in the middle of chaos. Again, visibility played a paradoxical role. Coca-Cola was not the only company using disposable packaging, but its volume and the power of its image made it the most obvious face of a problem that goes far beyond a single brand. Social pressure grew. Campaigns multiplied, calling for a drastic reduction in the use of single-use plastics. Proposals emerged for laws requiring high percentages of recycled material in every bottle, and discussions began about mandatory return systems, container deposits, and concrete goals for recycling every unit placed on the market. The company responded with a series of public commitments. It announced recycling targets, objectives to incorporate recycled material into its bottles, collection programs in collaboration with local governments and organizations, and projects to redesign packaging to make it lighter, reusable, or easily recyclable. Campaigns appeared that spoke of a world without waste, of shared responsibility between company, consumer, and authorities, and of the need to see each used bottle not as trash, but as raw material for a new life. In addition, in many markets, efforts were made to strengthen the returnable container system, which offers a lower impact alternative when logistics allow it. However, the magnitude of the challenge made any progress seem, in the eyes of many, insufficient. Production remained gigantic, and every year millions of bottles ended up in places where no one collected them. For critics, the issue was not so much what percentage was recycled, but the underlying question, whether a business model built on a permanent volume of disposable packaging could be considered compatible with the idea of sustainability. The company, for its part, argued that the path lay in transforming the way waste is managed, in innovating materials, and in modifying consumer habits, rather than in completely renouncing a type of packaging that made it possible to reach corners of the world where the infrastructure for returnable glass was unworkable. In this context of environmental scrutiny, Coca-Cola began to integrate sustainability language into its overall strategy, not as a marginal department, but as a dimension that crosses decisions about investment, innovation, and communication. The company spoke of reducing greenhouse gas emissions throughout the chain, improving energy efficiency in factories and transport fleets, collaborating with suppliers to reduce the carbon footprint of ingredients and materials, and aligning those efforts with broader international objectives. The company knew that any step in that direction would have repercussions on its reputation, either strengthening it if perceived as genuine or damaging it if interpreted as mere green marketing. At the same time, in many markets, the brand experimented with sales formats that reduced the need for so many containers, dispensers at points of consumption, partnerships with establishments to encourage consumption in reusable cups, pilot tests of refillable packaging, and other solutions that, although fragmented, pointed to a deeper question: how to adapt a business built on the logic of packaged products to a world that increasingly demands circular models in which nothing is simply discarded. From the perspective of entrepreneurship, this stage is particularly revealing because it shows the less comfortable side of massive success. When a company manages to be everywhere, it also becomes responsible, at least in part, for the accumulated impacts of that being everywhere. Every bottle produced, every liter of water used, every truck traveling on highways, adds to an account that is no longer calculated solely in terms of revenue and profits, but also in terms of emissions, waste, and social perception. Brand management ceases to be only a matter of advertising creativity and begins to depend on technical, logistical, and ethical decisions. In such a demanding environment, Coca-Cola has had to learn to live with a sort of double gaze, that of those who still see in it a beverage linked to happy memories, and that of those who observe it as a case study on the challenges of a multinational, in a world that no longer accepts without question the codes of consumption of the past century. Solving that tension is not a single event. It is a long-term process that requires rethinking products, packaging, and models of relationship with the environment. And, at the same time, the company must continue doing what it has known how to do for more than 100 years: innovate its portfolio, adapt to new preferences, and find a way to remain relevant for a consumer who is increasingly demanding, better informed, and unwilling to settle for a brand offering only one way of understanding the beverage that accompanies daily life. From soft drink to ecosystem of brands. In the early years of the 21st century, when the internet stopped being a novelty and became the backbone of everyday life, and mobile phones ceased to be devices for making calls and turned into small screens through which the world is observed, Coca-Cola had to look at itself with uncomfortable sincerity. It was still a gigantic beverage company with an iconic brand, but the context in which it had shined for decades was no longer the same. The public consumed content in a fragmented way, jumped between platforms, compared products in seconds, and demanded options adapted to increasingly specific lifestyles, in such a way that the old formula of a single central product and massive marketing began to require a profound redesign. The path toward that redesign relied on an idea that gradually gained strength within the organization: to think of Coca-Cola less as the cola soft drink and more as a brand architecture capable of extending across different categories, sugar levels, formats, and consumption occasions. The red bottle with the classic formula remained the symbolic heart of the business, but around it, other proposals with their own personality began to consolidate, such as Coca-Cola Zero, which offered a flavor close to the original without sugar, or variants with subtle taste notes and different sweetness profiles, designed for audiences who wanted to identify with the brand even if their lifestyle led them to avoid traditional sugar. This multiplication of options responded to an evident need. In a world where people increasingly talk about personalization, offering a single path is perceived as a limitation. In parallel with these variants, the group expanded its presence in categories that, decades earlier, would have seemed foreign to its essence, but which today form part of its usual landscape. Bottled waters with and without gas, isotonic beverages for athletes, ready-to-drink teas, cold coffees, energy drinks, and a long list of regional brands acquired or developed according to the characteristics of each market. In some countries, a considerable part of the company's revenue comes from products in which the word Coca-Cola does not even appear on the label, which reflects how far the company has evolved from the original pharmacy syrup into a beverage conglomerate seeking to be present throughout the entire day, from the water one drinks after running to the beverage that accompanies a meal, including the mid-afternoon coffee. This expansion of the portfolio was not done chaotically, but through a strategy that combined internal innovation with acquisitions of brands that already had local roots. For an entrepreneur, this approach is especially interesting because it shows two complementary paths to growth: creating from scratch products that interpret new trends, and, at the same time, buying or partnering with companies that have already demonstrated an understanding of a specific consumer segment. In this way, the company does not depend solely on its ability to get every launch right, but rather builds a mosaic in which global proposals coexist with local gems that speak the language of each region. At the same time, the way these brands were communicated had to adapt to the digital revolution. Large television campaigns still existed, but they had ceased to be the exclusive center of the advertising universe. Video platforms, social networks, influencers, real-time shared content, all of that configured a new terrain where consumer attention was much harder to retain and where the conversation was no longer one-directional. Coca-Cola began experimenting with formats that invited the public to participate directly, such as the celebrated campaign in which the packages carried printed first names, encouraging people to look for their own name or the names of friends or family members, and to share photographs of those personalized bottles on social networks. That idea, which from the outside seemed like a simple, playful gesture, had a powerful effect. It made a standard product feel, for an instant, as though it had been designed for a specific person. The company also deepened its use of data to better understand consumption habits. The combination of information from sales, social networks, loyalty programs, agreements with restaurants, and distribution chains made it possible to build behavioral maps that helped decide which products to promote in each area, which messages worked best with specific age groups, and at what times of day it made the most sense to offer one beverage or another. This data-driven perspective did not replace brand instinct, but it complemented it with a precision that would have been unthinkable in the era of the first-hand painted posters. In terms of entrepreneurship, it symbolizes the transition from almost artisanal intuition to decision-making that combines creativity with rigorous analysis. In parallel with digitalization and diversification, the company faced consumers increasingly sensitive to issues of purpose and coherence. New generations were not satisfied with emotional campaigns. They wanted to know what was behind them, what the company's positions were on issues of inclusion, sustainability, well-being, and support for communities. Coca-Cola had to gradually incorporate initiatives that made its discourse tangible, from social projects to internal diversity policies, including investments in circular economy. The brand could no longer limit itself to speaking about unity and happiness without simultaneously showing how it attempted to contribute something concrete in a world full of inequalities and tensions. Meanwhile, competition became more fragmented. In addition to historical rivals in the cola territory, small local actors appeared, artisanal brands, natural or author proposals that appealed to a consumer who distrusts large corporations and seeks closer, more authentic stories. Faced with that scenario, Coca-Cola had to learn to coexist with an environment where there was no longer a single great battle for market share but thousands of simultaneous micro-battles, in which relevance was measured both in sales percentages and in presence within conversations, reviews, and individual decisions made in seconds before a refrigerator full of options. The pandemic of the early 2020 decade added yet another layer of complexity. With restaurants closed, events canceled, and drastic changes in social life, the company was forced to strengthen home consumption channels, adapt to new online shopping dynamics, and rethink its presence in a world where large gatherings were put on hold. At the same time, those months intensified the global reflection on well-being, mental health, nutrition, and the sense of community, so that brands seeking to remain relevant had to demonstrate empathy and real capacity for adaptation, not only reflected in advertisements but also in operational and long-term decisions. Nevertheless, despite crises and questioning, Coca-Cola's image as a cultural icon has remained alive. The logo continues to appear in series, films, travel photographs, concert memories, parties, and family gatherings. What has changed is the mental framework through which that icon is interpreted. It is no longer seen solely as a symbol of industrial modernity and mass consumption, but also as an ongoing case study of how a century-old company attempts to update itself amid gigantic technological, social, and environmental changes without losing the essence that made it recognizable to several generations. Viewed through the lens of entrepreneurship, Coca-Cola's recent trajectory leaves a lesson that goes beyond the size of the company. Any project that aspires to endure must be willing to become, over time, something broader than its original product. It must learn to operate as an ecosystem that integrates new needs, new sensibilities, and new ways of relating to those around it. The bottle that was born as a remedy in a pharmacy in Atlanta now coexists with dozens of brands, digital platforms, social impact programs, and environmental commitments, and that permanent transformation is what keeps the business in motion, even when the present is uncertain and the future is guaranteed to no one. And it is precisely in that continuous movement between tradition and reinvention where the story of Coca-Cola continues to be written every day, far from being closed, still open to the next chapters that the market and time force it to confront. Thank you for accompanying me on this intense journey through the history of Coca-Cola, a story that demonstrates how an idea can become a global legacy. Tell me in the comments which part surprised you the most and which other brand you would like to discover in future episodes. If you are passionate about entrepreneurship documentaries, I invite you to subscribe so you do not miss anything. Rest well. Good night.